Welcome to Conversations at the Crossroads, the podcast where spirituality meets the beautifully messy experience of being human. I'm Jenny, tarot reader, Reiki practitioner, witch, mentor, hairstylist, and the voice behind Conversations at the Crossroads. Each week, we gather here at the Crossroads to explore spirituality, personal growth, and tools that help us navigate the ever-evolving human journey. Some conversations will dive into the mystical, others into the practical, and sometimes we'll sit together with the hard stuff. Along the way, we may explore ideas that challenge us, stories that shift our perspective, or practices that help us walk our path with a little more intention. So wherever you're listening from, take a breath, settle in, and join me at the crossroads. Welcome back to the crossroads. We're standing at a pretty literal celestial crossroads right now because today, at the time of recording, August 12th, we have a solar eclipse. So I thought this was the perfect time to talk about eclipse season. And I don't want this episode to just be, there's an eclipse in Leo, so here's what it means for your zodiac sign. Because it's so much bigger and stranger and more interesting than that. I want to talk about what is physically happening above our heads. I want to talk about why eclipses have fascinated and terrified human beings for thousands of years. I want to get into the folklore and the mythology we've created around them. We'll obviously talk about the astrology and what this particular eclipse season invites us to explore. But mostly I want to talk about the eclipse as a metaphor, because there's something incredibly human about an eclipse. Something we rely on becomes obscured. The light changes, our perspective changes. For a moment, the world doesn't look the way it's supposed to look. And then the light comes back. And I think most of us have experienced our own versions of that. Those periods of life where suddenly we can't see the path ahead of us. A relationship changes, a career changes, someone dies, a belief we've carried for years stops making sense. We realize we've outgrown something, or maybe nothing dramatic happens at all. We just wake up one morning and realize that the life we've been living doesn't quite fit anymore. Those are crossroads. And one of the hardest things about standing at the crossroads is that we usually want to know where every road leads before we're willing to choose one. We want light, we want clarity, we want certainty. But eclipses remind us that sometimes the light becomes obscured. And maybe that doesn't always mean we're lost. So today, we're talking about what happens when the lights go out. But before we get mystical, let's get astronomical. Because one thing I really love about spirituality is that understanding the science behind something doesn't make it less magical to me. If anything, sometimes it makes it more incredible. A solar eclipse happens when the moon passes between the earth and the sun. The moon casts a shadow onto the earth, and depending on where you're standing, you may see the moon cover some or all of the sun. And today's eclipse is a total solar eclipse. Along what's called the path of totality, the moon will completely cover the visible face of the sun. Now, here's something that I think is absolutely wild. The sun is about 400 times wider than the moon, but the sun is also roughly 400 times farther away from us. So, from our perspective here on Earth, the two appear remarkably close to the same size in the sky. And that's why our moon can cover our enormous sun so beautifully. It's basically a cosmic perspective trick. And it won't always be this way. The moon is very slowly moving away from Earth. Eventually, hundreds of millions of years from now, the moon will appear too small in our sky to completely cover the sun. So, total solar eclipses belong to this particular chapter of Earth's existence, which I find kind of beautiful. We just happen to be alive during the part of the Earth's story where the moon and the sun can do this dance. But why don't eclipses happen every month? This is actually one of the things I remember wondering when I first started learning astrology about eclipses. If a solar eclipse happens at a new moon, and we have a new moon every month, why aren't we constantly having eclipses? And the answer is geometry. The moon doesn't orbit Earth on exactly the same flat plane that Earth orbits the sun. Its orbit is tilted about 5 degrees. So most of the time, during a new moon, the moon passes just a little above or below the sun from our perspective. During a full moon, it usually passes above or below Earth's shadow. But there are 2 points where the moon's orbit crosses the apparent path of the sun. Those are called lunar nodes. The ascending node is what astrology calls the north node, and the descending node is the south node. They're not planets, they're not asteroids, there's nothing physically sitting there. They're mathematical intersection points. And when the sun happens to be near one of those nodes at the same time as a new moon or full moon, the geometry lines up. Now we have the possibility of an eclipse. That's also why eclipses come in seasons. So, what is eclipse season? Astronomers actually use the term eclipse season. It's not just something astrologers invented for social media. There are periods when the sun is close enough to one of the moon's nodes for eclipses to happen. Each eclipse season lasts roughly a month. During that window, we'll usually experience at least 2 eclipses, sometimes 3. And they're separated roughly by 2 weeks because we're moving from new moon to full moon or vice versa. So eclipse isn't one random celestial event. It's part of a larger astronomical cycle. So today, on August 12th, the path of totality crosses Greenland, Iceland, northern Russia, Spain, and a small part of Portugal. A much larger area will see a partial eclipse, including parts of North America, Europe, and northern Africa. If you're listening from somewhere that only gets a partial eclipse, the moon will look like it's taking a bite out of the sun. And because I love all of you and would prefer that you retain functioning retinas, please do not stare at the sun. Regular sunglasses don't count. During the partial phases of the solar eclipse, you need proper eclipse glasses or another approved solar viewing method. If you're somewhere experiencing totality, it is only during the brief period of complete totality that the sun can be viewed without eclipse sunglasses. As soon as any portion of the bright sun begins to return, the glasses go back on. Spiritual enlightenment does not require retinal damage. So what happens during totality? This is where things get really strange. The moon gradually moves across the sun. The daylight begins to change. The temperature can drop. Shadows start behaving differently. Animals can react to the sudden darkness. The horizon can take on sunset-like colors. And then for people standing inside the moon's umbra, the darkest part of its shadow, the sun disappears. Day becomes something like twilight. Stars and planets can become visible, and around the black silhouette of the moon appears this ghostly white halo. That's the solar corona, the sun's outer atmosphere. The corona is always there. Right now, as you're listening to me, it's there. But normally we can't see it because the visible surface of the sun is overwhelmingly brighter. During totality, the moon blocks that bright surface, and suddenly something that was invisible becomes visible. Not because it appeared, because something brighter stopped drowning it out. And I want you to remember that, because we're going to come back to it. Now, let's rewind. Imagine that you don't know any of those things. You don't know about orbital inclination. You don't know about lunar nodes. You don't have an app telling you exactly when the eclipse begins. You're farming, you're hunting, you're cooking, you're walking through a village, and suddenly, in the middle of the day, the sun begins disappearing. Temperature drops. The animals start behaving strangely. The world goes dark. I think it's incredibly easy for modern people to look at ancient eclipse mythology and think, how could anyone believe that? But put yourself there. The sun is one of the most reliable things in human existence. Every morning it returns, it gives us warmth, it grows food, it marks time, it separates day from night. And then suddenly something is eating it. Of course, humans created stories. And what I find fascinating is how many cultures independently develop stories where some creature or supernatural force was literally consuming, attacking, or stealing the sun or moon. One of the most famous examples comes from ancient China. Eclipses were associated with a celestial dragon devouring the sun. People could make noise, bang drums, and create commotion in effort to frighten the creature away. And of course, eventually the sun returned. From the perspective of the people participating in the ritual, imagine how powerful that must have felt. The community gathers, everyone makes noise, the dragon releases the sun, order is restored. And there's something interesting there beyond whether everyone involved literally believed they were personally bullying a dragon into spitting the sun back out. When something frightening and uncontrollable happened, people did something together. They created ritual around uncertainty. And humans still do that. We light candles when someone dies and gather at funerals. We throw celebrations when people get married. We count down together on New Year's Eve. We make wishes over birthday candles, carry objects that belonged to the people we love. We mark beginnings and endings with ceremony. Ritual gives shape to moments that are otherwise too large, strange, or uncertain to hold. And I think sometimes we underestimate how powerful that is. A ritual doesn't necessarily have to change what is physically happening around us in order to change our relationship with what is happening. Sometimes ritual says, I can't control this, but I can witness it, I can mark it, and I can choose how I meet it. In Hindu mythology, eclipses are associated with the story of Rahu. There are different tellings, but the basic story involves the gods and demons obtaining Amrita, the nectar of immortality. Rahu disguises himself and slips among the gods to drink it. But the sun and moon recognize him and reveal what he's done. Vishnu cuts off Rahu's head. Unfortunately, Rahu has already tasted the nectar, so the head is immortal. And Rahu, understandably holding something of a grudge, pursues the sun and moon across the heavens. When he catches one, he swallows it. But because he has no body, the sun or moon eventually emerge again, and the eclipse ends. I love the story because it turns an eclipse into a cosmic cycle of pursuit, consumption, and release. The darkness comes, but it cannot hold the light forever. There's something almost comforting in the inevitability of that. The story contains fear, chaos, revenge, and darkness, but it also contains return. The sun comes back. The moon comes back. The story continues. In Norse mythology, the sun and moon are pursued across the sky by wolves. Skoll pursues the sun, while Hades pursues the moon. The celestial bodies continue moving with these wolves chasing behind them. And in the mythology surrounding Ragnarok, those wolves eventually catch their prey. Again, we find this image, something pursuing the light, something threatening the natural order, and humans looking upward, trying to understand what they're witnessing. Korean eclipse folklore includes stories of supernatural dogs attempting to capture the sun or moon. They bite into these celestial objects but can't carry them away fully. And the eclipse becomes the mark of that attempted theft. Again, something takes a bite out of the light and then releases it. Isn't it fascinating how often that image appears in different places, in different cultures, in different languages, within different religious systems? Yet human beings repeatedly looked at the eclipse and saw something consuming the light. Maybe that's because the visual itself invites that interpretation. But I also think it says something about us. Darkness often feels active to us. When we lose clarity, we don't usually think, interesting, visibility is temporarily changed. We think something has gone wrong. Something has taken the thing that made us safe. Some cultures looked at eclipses as omens. Other cultures weren't necessarily imagining animals eating the sun. Sometimes eclipses were interpreted as messages. And often those messages were not particularly cheerful. In ancient Mesopotamia, celestial events were carefully observed and interpreted as omens. Eclipses could be seen as particularly dangerous signs for kings and rulers. There was even a practice sometimes referred to as the substitute king ritual. If an eclipse or another omen appeared to predict danger for the king, someone else could temporarily be installed in his place. The idea was essentially that the omen would fall upon the substitute instead, which has to be one of history's worst promotions. Congratulations, you're king. Oh my gods, really? Yes, please don't ask why. But there's something important underneath all of these traditions. For much of human history, the sky wasn't decoration. The sky was information. The sun told you when to work. The moon helped mark time. Stars guided travelers. Seasonal celestial patterns helped agricultural societies understand when to plant and harvest. So when the sky behaved unusually, people really paid attention. An eclipse wasn't just something pretty to look at. It was a disruption in the order of things, and humans were meaning-making creatures. When the world changes suddenly, we ask, what does this mean? And we still do that. Maybe now, instead of running outside banging pots at a dragon, we open TikTok and watch 17 astrologers explain why our ex is about to text us. Same nervous system, different technology. So let's bring astrology back into this. The really interesting bridge between astronomy and astrology here is that astrology didn't invent the lunar nodes. They're real astronomical points. What astrology does is assign symbolic meaning to them. In modern Western astrology, the North Node is commonly associated with growth, development, unfamiliar territory, and qualities we're learning to embody. The South Node is associated with familiarity, establishing patterns, things we've already developed, and sometimes things we're being asked to release or relate to differently. I think sometimes this gets oversimplified into North Node equals good future, South Node equals bad past. And I don't really love that because your past isn't inherently bad. Familiarity isn't inherently bad, and growth isn't inherently comfortable or even pleasant. Sometimes the South Node represents skills you already possess. The problem isn't that they're wrong. The problem can be that they're so familiar that you default to them even when another response might serve you better. Think about it this way. Maybe you've spent your whole life being incredibly independent, and that is strength. You learned how to survive. You learned how to solve problems. You've learned not to depend on anybody. And then you reach a point in your life where growth looks like allowing someone to help you. Your independence hasn't suddenly become bad. It's simply not the only tool you're supposed to have. Or maybe you learned very young how to keep everyone around you happy. You can read a room. You can anticipate people's needs. You know exactly how to smooth things over. That may have protected you once. It may still make you compassionate and perceptive, but eventually growth might require allowing someone to be disappointed with you. The old skill isn't evil. It's just no longer the answer to every situation. That's a much more useful way, at least for me, to think about the nodes. One side contains something known, the other asks us to stretch. And eclipses occur around that axis, which is part of why astrology has associated them with turning points, changes in direction, endings, beginnings, and moments when something previously hidden can become much more obvious. But I also think we need to be careful with the word destiny. Astrology can sometimes slide into this idea that everything happening to us was cosmically predetermined, and I've been guilty myself of looking at it that way. And maybe that's part of your belief system, but I've personally been finding it now more empowering when I treat it as a language of themes rather than a script I have no choice but to perform. An eclipse gives me a theme. I still have agency inside of it. So let's talk specifically about today. Today's eclipse is a new moon solar eclipse about 20 degrees of Leo. If you know your birth chart, you can look at which house contains that area of Leo to get another layer of where these themes might be showing up for you. And if you have significant placements around that degree, you may find the symbolism especially interesting. But even if you don't know your chart at all, we can work with the archetype of Leo. Leo is ruled by the sun. And the sun in astrology is associated with identity, vitality, consciousness, creativity, and the self. Leo asks, what makes me feel alive? Leo is creative, expressive, playful, dramatic, generous, warm, and proud. It wants to create something and say, look what came through me. And I don't think that's shallow. Human beings want to be seen. We want somebody to witness us. Think about a child drawing a picture. They don't quietly finish it and file it away and say, my artistic fulfillment is entirely intrinsic. No, they come running into the room. Look what I made. There's something deeply human about that. We want to express ourselves and have that expression witnessed. The shadow side, of course, is when being witnessed becomes being validated, when expression becomes performance, when our sense of self becomes dependent on applause. And that gives us a fascinating question during a solar eclipse in Leo. Who are you when nobody is applauding? What do you create when nobody sees it? What brings you joy that you don't post about? What parts of yourself exist because they're genuinely yours? And what parts have become performances designed to keep receiving a particular reaction? I know, heavy stuff. This connects directly to something I've been thinking about lately, though. What does it actually mean to live authentically? because we often confuse authenticity with consistency. We think, if I was this person before and now I'm different, one of those versions must have been fake. But I don't think that's true. Something can have been completely authentic to you 10 years ago and no longer be authentic today. Something could have been authentic to you 2 hours ago that's not authentic today. You're allowed to evolve. You're allowed to change your beliefs. You're allowed to discover that the career you desperately wanted isn't what you want anymore. You're allowed to change your aesthetic, your spiritual practice, and change your relationships, your boundaries, your dreams, change your understanding of yourself. Sometimes the bravest thing we can admit is, that was me, and this is me too. The old identity doesn't have to be false for the new identity to be true. And I think there's a grief that can come with that too, because sometimes we aren't only releasing something that hurt us. Sometimes we outgrow something we loved. Sometimes an identity served us beautifully. Sometimes a dream really was our dream, and then it isn't anymore. And there's no villain, and there's nothing to blame. We've simply changed. And those can actually be some of the hardest endings, because it's much easier to walk away from something when we can say, oh, that was terrible. It's harder to say, that was beautiful, and I'm still done. So there's something almost too perfect about this symbolism. Leo is ruled by the sun, and during a solar eclipse, the sun itself becomes obscured. So symbolically, I think this gives us an opportunity to ask, what happens when the identity I normally rely on becomes obscured? Who am I without my job title or without being someone's partner? Who am I without being the strong one or the caretaker or the funny one or the successful one? Insert any of the labels here that you may be used to carrying for your identity. Because these identities aren't necessarily fake, they're roles. And underneath every role is a person. Sometimes we don't realize how tightly we've attached our sense of self to a role until that role changes. Maybe this eclipse is asking us to loosen our grips a little. Not who have I always been, but who am I becoming now? And this eclipse season, it doesn't end today. On August 28th in Universal Standard Time, we have a partial lunar eclipse. Depending where you are in the world, parts of that event begin on the evening of the 27th. This lunar eclipse is visible from areas including the Americas, Europe, and Africa. And astrologically, that full moon eclipse falls in Pisces. So now we move from Leo into a very different archetype. Leo says, this is me. Pisces asks, where does me end? Pisces is associated with intuition and dreams, spirituality, compassion, imagination, surrender, and our connection to something larger than ourselves. But Pisces also has a shadow: escapism, idealization, poor boundaries, seeing what we wish were instead of what actually is, avoiding reality because it feels gentler. So I think that the movement between these two eclipses gives us a fascinating conversation. The Leo eclipse asks, what wants to be expressed through me? And the Pisces eclipse asks, what illusion might I need to release? Leo, who am I? Pisces, what am I willing to surrender? Leo, let me be seen. Pisces, let me stop controlling how I'm seen. Maybe that's part of authenticity too. Not just having the courage to express yourself, but releasing the need to control everyone else's interpretation of you. Because people are gonna misunderstand you. People will carry versions of you in their heads that you can't edit. Somebody knows you as the person you were 10 years ago. Someone else knows you through the worst interaction they ever had with you. Somebody knows you through your work. Someone else knows you intimately. Someone follows you online and has constructed an entire imaginary version of you based on 60-second videos. You can't really manage all of those versions. At some point, authenticity requires surrendering control over how you're perceived. And that feels very Leo to Pisces to me. Now, we need to talk about something that I think is really important. Because eclipse season online gets really dramatic. Don't manifest. Don't charge your crystals. Don't do spell work. Don't make major decisions. Don't start relationships. Don't end relationships. Don't breathe too aggressively because the nodes are listening. And I think fear-based spirituality deserves scrutiny. There are traditions and astrological schools that treat eclipses with caution, and I'm not dismissing those traditions. But I also don't think we need to turn every celestial event into something we're afraid of. Astronomically, an eclipse is a predictable alignment involving the sun, moon, and earth. Astrologically, human beings have spent centuries assigning symbolic meaning into celestial events. Spiritually, each of us gets to decide what relationship we have with that symbolism. Those are three very different things. They can coexist without pretending that they're identical. I can understand the physics of an eclipse and still stand underneath the sky and feel a sense of awe. I can understand that tarot cards are pieces of printed cardstock and still use them to uncover something meaningful for myself. Understanding the mechanism doesn't necessarily destroy the meaning. I personally find astrology most useful when it helps us ask better questions rather than when it claims to give us guaranteed answers. There's a huge difference between saying, this eclipse is going to destroy your relationship, and saying, this eclipse carries symbolism around identity and change. Is there anywhere in your relationships where those themes already feel alive? One gives your power away, the other gives you a lens. And I think that's an important distinction. Because if you go into eclipse season convinced that something terrible is going to happen, your brain is very good at collecting evidence. A friend doesn't text back. Oh, the eclipse. Your car battery dies. Oh, the eclipse. Your DoorDash arrives without your ranch dressing. The nodes have spoken. At some point, we need discernment. We can find meaning without making ourselves afraid of ordinary life. So instead of asking, what is this eclipse going to do to me? I prefer, what does this eclipse invite me to notice? And this is really the heart of this episode for me. An eclipse is an experience of temporary obscuration. The sun doesn't actually disappear. The moon doesn't destroy it. The light is still there. Our relationship to it changes temporarily because something has moved between us and it. And I think life does that to us constantly. There are times when something we normally trust becomes impossible to see. Our sense of purpose, our confidence, our faith, our identity, our plan. We interpret the absence of visibility as the absence of the thing itself. object permanence, am I right? I can't feel confident, so maybe I'm not capable. I can't see where this is going, so maybe I'm on the wrong path. I don't feel connected spiritually, so maybe I've lost my spirituality. I don't recognize myself right now, so maybe I've lost myself. But obscured isn't the same thing as gone. Sometimes something is simply between you and the light. We love clarity, especially when we're standing at a crossroads. We want a sign. We want the tarot card and the astrology transit. We want our friend to tell us what to do. We want the universe to send a raven carrying a notarized document. Dear Jenny, this is the correct decision. Warm regards, the universe. Unfortunately, life rarely operates that way. Sometimes you have to choose without knowing. Ugh, right? Sometimes you have to say no without knowing what the next yes will be. Sometimes you leave before you know where you're going. Sometimes you admit something isn't working before you know how to fix it. And I think one of the deepest forms of self-trust is not believing you'll always make the perfect decision. It's believing that if you make the wrong one, you'll still be able to meet yourself there. You can change direction. You can learn. You can apologize. You can begin again. Maybe self-trust isn't, I know exactly where this road goes. Maybe it's more like, I trust myself to walk until I know more. And that's a very different kind of confidence. It doesn't require certainty. It requires relationship with yourself. So I want to come back to the corona, because out of everything about eclipses, the image of the corona keeps sitting in my mind, that the sun's corona is always there. But normally we can't see it because the visible surface of the sun is so bright. During totality, the moon covers that overwhelming brightness, and something quieter becomes visible. Think about how often that happens in our own lives. There are things so loud they drown out everything else. A relationship, a career, a crisis, the need to survive, the need to achieve, the need to be liked, the identity we've spent years building. And sometimes when one of those things becomes obscured or falls away, we panic because all we can see is what's missing. But what if we also asked, what can I see now that I couldn't see before? Maybe losing the plan reveals the desire underneath the plan. Maybe the relationship ending reveals how much of yourself you had abandoned to maintain it. Maybe burnout reveals your definition of success was never sustainable. Maybe disappointment reveals an expectation you didn't realize you were carrying. The corona didn't simply appear. It was there the whole time. You just needed different conditions to see it. And I think that's really beautiful. Not because every painful thing happens for a reason. I don't think we need to romanticize suffering. Sometimes terrible things happen and they're simply terrible. But after something happens, we still get to decide what we do with the landscape we're standing on. Meaning doesn't have to be the cause of suffering to become something we create afterward. And I think there's a really important difference between those two ideas. This happened because the universe wanted to teach me something can become really cruel when we're talking about grief, trauma, illness, or tragedy. But this happened, and now I get to decide how I carry it forward. That idea leaves us with more agency, I think. Maybe we don't always discover meaning but sometimes we make it. So, what do we actually do with all of this? I think eclipse season can be a practice of witnessing, not predicting or forcing, but witnessing, noticing what's changing. Notice what you're resisting. Notice what keeps resurfacing or where you're craving recognition. Notice what feels strangely exciting. Notice what we keep imagining. And maybe don't immediately act on every single thing you notice. Sometimes awareness needs a little more time before it becomes action. We live in a culture that loves immediate transformation. Identify problem, fix problem, new morning routine, new boundaries, new personality. Buy 12 storage bins, become unrecognizable by Thursday. But transformation doesn't always work that way because sometimes we need to sit with something. Sometimes we need an old identity to become uncomfortable before we're ready to remove it. Sometimes we need to grieve something even when we know releasing it is right. Sometimes we're standing at a crossroads longer than we like. And maybe the crossroads isn't wasted time. Maybe that's where we're gathering the information we need to choose. There's also something I really like about simply documenting eclipse seasons. Because if we're going to use astrology as reflective practice, we don't always need to know immediately what everything means. Write down what's happening. What are you thinking about? What conversations are coming up? What relationships feel different? What are you questioning? And then come back to it later. Because sometimes you don't recognize a turning point when you're standing inside of it. Sometimes the meaning only becomes visible in hindsight. That's why they say hindsight is 20/20. And speaking of coming back later, I want to give you a little celestial calendar because today isn't our last date with the shadow. If you like working with eclipses intentionally, grab your calendar and mark some of these dates. Not because I want you anxiously counting down to the next cosmic emergency, quite the opposite. I think it can be really interesting to use these dates as checkpoints. So first of all, of course, today, August 12th, the solar eclipse we've been talking about through this episode. Astrologically, this is our Leo new moon solar eclipse. So this is where I would begin your eclipse season observations. What is coming up around identity and creativity and visibility and authenticity? Where are you thinking about who you are and who you're becoming? You don't need a dramatic answer today. Just notice. August 28th, a little more than 2 weeks later, we have a partial lunar eclipse. This eclipse will be visible across areas including Eastern Pacific, the Americas, Europe, and Africa. Unlike today's solar eclipse, which happens on the new moon, this is a lunar eclipse that occurs on a full moon. The Earth moves between the sun and the moon, and the Earth's shadow falls across the moon. So already astronomically and symbolically, we're working with a very different image. Our next solar eclipse comes February 6th, 2027, and this one is an annular solar eclipse. And an annular solar eclipse happens when the moon passes directly between the Earth and the sun, but it's farther away from the Earth in its orbit and therefore appears slightly smaller in our sky. So it doesn't completely cover the sun. Instead, the outer edge of the sun remains visible around the moon, and it creates that famous ring of fire, which is another incredibly potent symbol if you want to work with eclipses spiritually. February 20th, We have a penumbral lunar eclipse, and that is a good opportunity to explain that not every eclipse looks dramatic. During a penumbral lunar eclipse, the moon moves through the lighter outer portion of the Earth's shadow rather than passing deeply into the dark umbra, so the visual effect can be much subtler. You might see a slight shading or dimming across part of the moon rather than the dramatic dark bite or blood red moon people tend to associate with lunar eclipses. And honestly, I kind of love that too, because not every transition in our lives announces itself. Not every crossroads looks like a crossroads. Some change arrives quietly. Sometimes you don't have a tower moment. Sometimes you just realize, I don't want this anymore. Or, you know, I think I'm ready. Or this doesn't feel like home now. The sky doesn't always have to go completely dark for something to shift. July 18th, 2027 is another penumbral lunar eclipse. August 2nd, 2027, we get a big one, another total solar eclipse. Its path of totality crosses areas including southern Spain and stretches across North Africa and into parts of the Middle East. And this eclipse is especially remarkable because totality near its maximum lasts for more than 6 minutes. 6 minutes. That doesn't sound like very long until you imagine standing outside in the middle of the day, watching the sun disappear for 6 entire minutes. Eclipses have frightened, fascinated, and inspired human beings for thousands of years. We've imagined dragons following the sun, wolves chasing it across the sky, immortal beings taking revenge, celestial dogs stealing the light. And now we understand the astronomy. We can calculate the orbit. We can predict the shadow. We can tell you where it will fall and when it will move away. But I don't think knowing how an eclipse works makes it any less extraordinary. Today, the moon passes between the Earth and the sun. For people standing inside a narrow ribbon of shadow, day will briefly become night. Something enormous will disappear behind something much smaller simply because of where they're standing. And around that darkness, something normally invisible will appear. The corona. Something that was there the entire time. And eventually the moon will keep moving and the light will return. And maybe there's something worth carrying with us in that. Because there will be times in our lives when we can't see the light. There will be times when we don't know who we are becoming. When something that used to make sense suddenly doesn't. And when the road ahead disappears into darkness. Maybe the absence of clarity doesn't always mean we've lost our way. Maybe something has simply been obscured. So as always, I want to leave you with some journal prompts. And I would encourage you not to rush through these. Take one, sit with it, come back to the others throughout eclipse season. Where am I performing a version of myself that no longer feels authentic? And this is not where have I been fake? This is where have I changed without giving myself permission to acknowledge that I've changed? Where am I making myself smaller because belonging feels safer than being fully seen? What am I trying to force clarity around right now? What answer are you demanding from yourself? And what would happen if you admitted, I don't know yet? What has become obscured or disrupted lately? And what can I see now that I couldn't see before? When the light comes back, what do I hope I can see more clearly? So as we move through eclipse season, pay attention. Not because the sky is threatening you and not because you need to predict what's coming, but because every once in a while, nature gives us a spectacular reminder that darkness and light aren't always opposites. And if you find yourself standing at a crossroads in the dark, you don't have to know where every road leads. You only need enough light to take your next step. So be kind to yourself, be gentle with yourself, and I can't wait to see you again at the crossroads. Bye!